Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, where you are in the world. This is Mark Nias. Start a new podcast series called Sea Stories. Pretty much I'd like to get stories of vets like myself, prior Navy service member, and also served in Operation Enduring Freedom. New podcast series, Sea Stories, where I talk to fellow vets and we share memorable stories of when we served. Today, episode 1, my first special guest today is E.T. Had the pleasure of serving with him on the USS Bonhomme Richard. We got Matt Holden here on Sea Stories. How you doing?
Hey, Mark. What's up, man?
Oh, man, doing pretty good, man. Thank you for being on the show today, man. Like I said, this is a podcast series I came up with along my journey post-Navy. Any job that I had, well, any job, you run into service members. We get together and we just talk, man. Talk about the times that we had in the military. Civilians don't believe us. Awkward enough, as of right now, I work at American Airlines, and just by sharing my sea stories or service, or when I served, I actually worked with a guy that used to work with my mom when she was stationed in Fightertown, USA, or formerly of NAS Miramar.
Oh,
when
wow.
I was like 7 and 8. So, hey, welcome to the show. And so I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Matt, post-Navy or pre-Navy, what were you doing, man? Where were you before you decided to join the Navy?
So I wasn't really doing much, which led me to join the Navy. I had just graduated high school, and previously, like in my junior year, I had joined the Air Force,
Okay.
like as soon as you could. So when I was like 16, and then I finished my junior year, went into my senior year, and decided that I didn't want to go in the military. So I ended up getting out of my delayed enlistment program for the Air Force. They weren't happy about it, but they finally let me out of it. And then I decided I was going to go to college. So I went to my first year at community college, and I lasted about 5 weeks and realized that wasn't for me either. So my brother was prior Navy. He was stationed down here in San Diego, and he worked at a high school, and he told me that he knew the Navy recruiter at the high school that he worked at. So he passed my number along. Guy called me up, had me signed up in like a day, and I was gone like 2 months later.
Wow.
So yeah, I wasn't really doing much, man. I was waiting tables at a little restaurant. Just kind of didn't have any direction. So I decided I'd get out of there and join the Navy and find something that I wanted to do.
So, and you're from Sacramento. So was this in, are you from Sacramento? I'm trying to.
No, I'm actually from Bakersfield.
Bakersfield.
Remember?
I was,
Because I was right down the street when you were at Lemoore. I was growing up just right down the street. Yeah.
Okay, I totally get it. Man.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing in the San Joaquin Valley. I was stationed in Lemoore. I was stationed in Lemoore. I thought I was going to Southern California. I didn't know I was going to Green Acres.
Yeah, not a lot going on, especially back in the mid 90s. There was not a lot of opportunities there. So yeah, and like I said, my brother had served. Both of my sisters had served before in the Army and in the Air Force. So it was a military family, and it was always kind of what I knew I wanted to do and what I was supposed to do. I just had a little hesitation there after I graduated high school and thought maybe it wasn't for me, but 4 months later, I was signed up and shipping out. So,
so your story is kind of similar to mine, man. 'Cause my mom, retired yeoman. My dad was in the Navy, and my stepdad was a recruiter.
Oh, wow.
At the time, I lived in Mississippi. The first time he approached me to join the Navy, I was like, nah. But then after deciding I wasn't going to any college in Mississippi, decided to join the military. So what duty stations were you at? I remember we met at Lemoore. I mean, not Lemoore. I'm sorry, the Bonhomme Richard.
Yeah, that was my only duty station. Being an ET, our schools were so long, so I went straight to boot camp, walked across the street, went to A school and Tech Corps over there. For ETs and FCs, we all went to a common, I forget what it's called now, but it was called something like Tech Corps School. Where FCs and ETs, they taught you like basic electronics. When my brother was in, it was called BW. It was like basic electronics in education or something. And then you split off into ET and FC when you get to A school. So then I went, 2 buildings over, went to A school. So I was out in Great Lakes for a long time. I was out there for like a year. Yeah. between boot camp and both my schools. I was there for a year, ended up buying a car. And then when I got my orders, I picked San Diego so I could get back close to home.
Yeah.
And drove my car from Great Lakes back to made a stop in Bakersfield, and then came down to San Diego and went to C school down here for the SPIS 67 navigational radar. And that was my C school. And then I got to the ship. So I had been in for a minute, and then I spent my next 4 years on the ship, and then I was out. So
wow. So you being on the boat, I know you got some stories. And you were on during when we had to do Operation Enduring Freedom, or after September 11th.
Yeah, I was on the next two deployments that we did basically back to back. So I did Operation Enduring Freedom right after September 11th, and then I did Operation Iraqi Freedom like 5 months after we got back. We had that captain that wanted to get a star, so he volunteered us to turn around and go right back.
The Juice, right?
The Juice, yeah.
Juice. After Operation Enduring Freedom, I threw my deuces up. My enlistment was over. Like, hey, I'm out.
Yeah.
So, with that backstory, tell us a memorable sea story. Then this is a true sea story because you're on the Bonhomme Richard.
Well, yeah, you might remember this. So, I have a couple that, usually come up when I start telling stories, but I think one of the crazier ones for maybe people who didn't serve is that, when we were out there after September 11th, right, we were attacking Afghanistan, but then when we went over for Iraqi freedom, it was all about Iraq and having the weapons of mass destruction. So basically from the day we left port in San Diego, we were told that there was a high chance of chemical weapons being used. So we had to carry around our gas mask at all times, right?
Oh, yeah.
Before we would drill with them and stuff like that, and we kept them in our GQ space or in our shop. But on that deployment, we were walking around the ship with them on person. So most of us kind of thought, whatever, we're out in the ocean, nothing's going to happen. And then, so it was just a regular, weekend day. I think it was Saturday or Sunday because I was kind of sleeping in a little bit. And I just remember waking up, somebody ripped the curtains open on my rack, and they leaned in and they had their gas mask on. They're just like, get out of your rack, get the GQ, like I couldn't even understand what they were saying. I was still like half asleep. Yeah. And I realized in the background, I hear the chemical alarm going off, and you can't miss that one. It's that just loud, piercing sound. So I realized, oh, shit, man, the chemical alarm's gone off. So I hop out of my rack, put on my coveralls, throw on my gas mask. I'm running out of berthing, and our berthing was like 2 decks down from the main deck. So we're jamming up through ladders. Everybody's trying to dog doors. And I don't know if you remember that airlock.
Yeah.
Right next to the galley line. You know how there was like an airlock right there? Everybody was trying to get to their GQ station. Everybody's wearing gas masks. Nobody, you can't see out of the sides of your gas mask. And everybody's freaking out. We got in that airlock and we're trying to jam it shut. There's like, I don't know, probably 9 of us crammed in there like a clown car, man, trying to get through. And it was just wild, man. It's funny to tell it now, but looking back, it was crazy. So I finally got up to my GQ spot, which was in radar 1. It was like on the 03 or 04 level in the island. And it was just me and this dude, FC2 at the time, Ben Kohler. And that was our GQ station. It was this giant radar room with my radar was like in a little corner of it. And then the rest of the giant room was filled up with his radar. He was a 48 tech. So he was, that thing's like the 3-dimensional radar. So it took up a ton of space. And so we're kind of freaking out, and they're coming over the 1MC, and they're telling us, like, hey, man, we're checking it out. Everybody stay in your GQ stations. Keep your gas masks on. And we just started playing cards. We didn't know what else to do. So, like I said, it's kind of funny looking back on it because at least I did. I don't know how Ben felt, but I know for a minute there, like, I literally thought I'm going to die, man. I was like, hey, if they hit the ship with some kind of chemical thing, like, I didn't get here in time. I didn't get my gas mask on time. I'm sure all like the hatches didn't get dogged in time. Like, and I'm just thinking about all the trainings we had where they're talking about all the different chemical agents and like skin peeling off, and I'm like, okay, I buttoned my coverall sleeves and I put my pant legs in my socks. You know what I mean? Like that's not going to help me.
What's crazy? I think when we had to do Operation Enduring Freedom, I remember it all clear as day, like when the captain told us there's a 99.9% chance we're going to war. Do you remember all the watches we had after 9/11 on the ship? And I just remember, like, I shut a lot of stuff down. Do you remember when we were in Singapore? When, like, I think the boat had broken and we had to pull into Singapore, and we had like a warning. I just remember this because I remember Ford like, "Hey, it's GQ, everybody get up."
Yeah.
But I think it was like the night before. It was like the night after New Year's, so we were all kind of like, I know I was hungover, and then I remember the captain secured.
That's one of the main things I remember about Singapore is that we spent New Year's Eve there.
Yeah. So then the captain secured Liberty, but then he was like, "No, you guys can go on Liberty." And I remember I was like, "I gotta get the hell off this ship." So I got a cab and I got a hotel room off the ship. And I remember the guy that was in the cab with me telling me, like, "Look, let me be your cab driver because there's guys here in Singapore. The Al-Qaeda's here. They want to attack you or whatever." And me, I'm like, "Whatever, dude. Just get me to my hotel. If I need to go back to the ship and need to go out in town, I'll give you a buzz." And I remember, like, thinking, like, how would they attack us? And I remember at one time while we were there, while we were in port, I had watch, like, gate, by the gate and by the ship. And I remember, like, people riding baskets with the little, riding bikes with the baskets, but I didn't think too much of it. And I remember when we pulled out, and this scared the hell out of me. This was like a wake-up call for me, like, yo, this is real. I remember when we pulled out, I was actually in our admin room on a computer, and now whoever was in Afghanistan, I think Marines or the Army, they found videos, and they were actually doing surveillance of us. And they actually were the way that they were plotting on bombing our ship was when the people with the little bikes with the basket on it.
Yeah.
And this is as we were pulling out, man, and I was like, yo, it just got real.
Yeah. I don't remember that, but I do remember that Liberty got secured, and I remember they only let us out if we had like a Liberty buddy, and we had to, like, if we were staying in a hotel, we had to give them the number of our hotel and the room we were in, so they could recall us like immediately. And I remember, I was young, man. I was like, I think when we went to Singapore, I was 19, maybe 20.
Yeah, because
I thought it was a joke. I'm like, whatever, we're fine. They're just being. I
remember that we had that log, and actually Brock Blair was my Liberty buddy. You remember Brock? He kind of
yeah.
Oh my goodness, man! You just brought back memories. So I know being on a Bonhomme Richard, because that was my second duty station. I was like, oh my god! To me, sometimes the Bonnie Dick felt like Oz. Sometimes.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but I know you got some more stories, man. From the man, that was your whole tour was on the Bonnie Dick.
Yeah, I mean, I was there for a minute, and I did 2 back-to-back deployments, so there was always something wild going on. And that ship, I wasn't on any other ships in my career, but I just, and I know everybody has sea stories, and everybody thinks their ship was wild, but the BHR was wild, man. It was like brand new commission. Half the people on the boat were plank owners, so they had like built the boat. They were tired. Yeah. You know what I mean? They like took personal pride in it. I just feel like it was a different vibe. This isn't like a story of mine, but I remember one time we had karaoke on the mess decks, and this dude, he was singing, what's that song where talk about Once Got Busy in a Burger King bathroom?
Oh, the Humpty Dance, yeah.
The Humpty Dance. But he changed the lyrics to say, I once got busy in a Bonhomme bathroom. And like the whole ship was down there on the mess deck listening to it, and everybody just like went wild. And there were officers and chiefs, and you know what I mean? Like nobody, it was like when you wanted to have fun on that boat, nobody cared. And then when it came time to work, everybody had to work. And I don't know, maybe it was like that on all the ships, but it was wild. So I think one of the other ones that comes to mind is when we went out to Thailand, and there's a lot of sea stories you can tell about being around Thailand. But
Thailand is real.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. But we had just got to Thailand, and my radar had broken, and I was a Spiz 67 tech, which is the main navigational radar, right? We had a bunch of air radars. We had like 3 different air radars. We had a bunch of fire control radars, but for navigation, we had one, and it was the 67. We had like a little one they call the 73 that was on the bridge, but it's like a Furuno. It's like a commercial one that people put on like yachts. You know what I mean? So not really up to like military standards. So the 67 was really our main navigational radar, and it broke. And so I remember I was working nights at the time. So I was working from 7 at night till 7 in the morning. And it had been down all day. And I got woken up and they were like, hey, the radar is broke. You got to come up here and help it out. And so I went to troubleshoot, and I ended up being up for like, I think a day trying to troubleshoot it.
Wow.
And yeah, it was pretty wild, man. These tech manuals that the Navy gives you, you know, they're like 3 feet wide and a foot tall and, you know, 150 pages thick. And, you know, those radars are pretty detailed. I'm not sure what they're like now. I don't know if they're a lot of like, you know, like a lot of just swap it out and pop in a whole new module or whatever. But back then it was like the lowest really you could get was like a card. You could pop out a card, but there were like 80 cards in the radar. You know what I mean? So you had to go through every single one. But so I ended up staying up for like a day and a half. I finally find out what the problem is. So I go brief everybody and they're like, yeah, we don't have that part on board, but we're going to be in Thailand tomorrow. And the USS Decatur has that part. So I'm like, all right, well, we'll get the part from the Decatur. I'll slap it in and we'll be good. Well, they tell me later, they're like, hey, you got to go get that part. And I'm like, what?
You got to go get it.
How am I going to go get this part? And so we're in port and we're anchored. And so is the Decatur, because in Thailand, there was nowhere for us to pull in. Everybody anchored off and took the Liberty boats in.
Yeah.
So they lowered the captain's rib and they brought it down to the well deck and they made me get on the captain's rib, right? And they drove me. It was like a mile across open ocean over to the Decatur. And then I get over to the Decatur and I got to climb the little ladder to get up on that destroyer.
Wow.
Yeah. It was wild for me, man. Like I said, you know, again, I'm like a 20-year-old kid and I'm like out cruising across the ocean in this little, you know, captain's boat. And so I get on the boat and I bump into this guy, ET3 Brown, and he was in my C school. So I hadn't seen anybody from school in like 2 years. Mm-hmm. And I bump into this guy and he's like, hey, Holden, what's up? And I'm like, hey, what's going on, man? My radar broke and I'm here for a part. He's like, yeah. Hey, we got that part for you, but hey, our 67's broken too and we can't figure it out.
Oh, man.
So I'm like, all right. So I spent like another like 5-6 hours on their boat looking at their 67. I got the part in hand for our ship, but they're asking me to help them out. So I'm sitting there and I'm going through it, trying to help them figure it out. We finally get it figured out what the problem is. And they're, you know, like, cool, thanks, man, appreciate it. So I get back in the rib and, all right, cool, I'm going to cruise a mile away. I'm going to get back on the boat and I'm going to fix this. Well, turns out in Thailand, they have tropical storms all the time that come out of nowhere. So as soon as we left the Decatur, the water starts getting choppy. It starts pouring rain. Man. And you know what a rib looks like. It's just a little rubber hole inflatable boat. You know what I mean?
It's tossed like, around, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm bouncing around, and I've got this IC card, right? It's like, you know, maybe a foot by a foot. And supply says it's worth like $70,000. And it's in this little plastic electrostatic discharge bag. And now we got a thunderstorm hitting on us. So,
oh, man.
Yeah, we're bouncing all over the ocean. It starts pouring rain. I got the $70,000 card in my hands, and the Decatur is the only boat within 500 miles that has this part. So if I lose this part or it gets wet or whatever, like, we're out of luck. And we were on our way back from Thailand. We had to transit the Straits of Malacca, I think.
Oh, Malacca, yeah.
Or Hormuz. I think we had to do both. And you can't do that without navigational radar, man. Like, the clearances on each side are like, you know, not even a nautical mile. And so I ended up shoving it down inside my coveralls, zipping my coveralls all the way up, and I laid down on the bottom of the rib in like the fetal position.
Oh, man.
Just to keep it dry. And the whole time it's just smacking and bouncing me, and I'm popping up, and like the boatswain mate that's driving it's just laughing at me, you know what I mean? And
yeah.
So that was a wild time. And then we get back to the boat, and I got to install this thing, and then I got to tune it up because the card that broke was like the transmit receive card, which is like the most important part of a radar. That's all radars do, is they transmit a signal and receive it, and they use timing to see how long it's been so they can find out where that signal stopped and bounced back, right?
Yeah.
So I had to retune the entire radar, and then I think it was about 3 a.m. when I finally got finished, and I went and briefed the CSO, and everything was all ready to go. So at that point, I'd been up for like 3 days, been tossed around the ocean. Yeah, it was pretty wild. And me and my OPO had to stay there. Bummer for him, man. He had to stay there and help me out. and make sure that everything was good before he could go on Liberty. I don't know if you remember him. His name was ET1 Leon.
Okay, yeah, I remember Leon.
He was from the islands too, so he kind of had that DB vibe too.
Darnell.
Yeah. And he was on, I forget what he was on before. I think he was on the Kitty Hawk before, so he'd always talk about like back on the Kitty Hawk, always like rapping to me about the way it was on the Kitty Hawk and all this stuff. But he had to stick around with me until I finished it. And I had never been to Thailand before. I think at this point on deployment, like the only places we'd been were like Hawaii or Guam or something.
I think like because Guam,
because it was 9/11, we didn't like take our time. You know what I mean? We went straight to the Gulf.
Yeah.
And this is our way back. So on the way back, we were hitting all the ports instead of doing like half there and half back. So I hadn't been to anywhere cool yet. And here we are. We're sitting off the coast of Phuket, Thailand, and I'm like 20 years old.
Phuket.
I'm like, man, I'm trying to get to Thailand. And he's sitting there telling me how rad it is the whole time and how, telling me old sea stories about the Philippines and Thailand. So we finally get it wrapped up. And he hops on a Liberty boat with me, and we pull into shore. And like I said, it's probably like 3 a.m. And we roll up to the pier where they were dropping us off, and there's just a line of cabs waiting for whoever wants to get in. And I remember he pulled up with me, and he's like, hey, here's a cab. Let's get in a cab and get into the city. And as soon as we got in the cab, the driver walked us around to the back of the trunk, opened up the trunk, and his whole trunk was like an ice chest. He had beer in there, he had booze, he had cigarettes, he had like anything you ever wanted. And I was just like, man, after 3 days of working on this radar, getting tossed around in the ocean, like this is a dream come true. And it was basically like adult Disneyland for the next 4 days.
Oh yeah, man. Thailand is, I tell people, they don't believe me, man. Thailand is the devil's playground. Shout out to Jason Severs with his Thai tattoo in the back of his neck. Dirty World on the back of his neck.
I'm going to tell him to listen to this. I'm going to tell him you gave him a shout out.
Yeah, I'm about to tell him, man. And you said you had one more, man, before we call this a wrap.
Yeah, I think the other one that came to mind, when you asked me about doing this, was the band on the ship and how we actually got to play a Steel Beach Picnic.
Oh yeah, Steel Beach Picnic. You got to explain the Steel Beach Picnic to.
Yeah. So for those of you that weren't in the Navy or didn't have to do like wartime deployments, right? A Steel Beach Picnic is where you go up on the flight deck, or I guess sometimes they pull a barge up if you're on like a destroyer or something, and they grill up a bunch of burgers and dogs, and everybody hangs out. But we had been underway for more than 45 days straight, which hadn't happened in a long time. So there's also a rule in the Navy where if you do more than 45 days straight at sea, you get a beer. It's called Beer Day. Everybody gets 2 beers.
Yeah.
And so we had a Steel Beach Picnic, and it was also Beer Day for us. And there were like old timers on our boat that had never had a beer day. They'd never been out more than like a couple weeks at a time. And here we are. We're at day like 49. And I think that deployment, we ended up doing like 93 days straight.
Yeah, it was rough.
Rain. Yeah,
it was rough.
That was a long time to be at sea, man.
Hey, before you go, I have to interrupt because I remember it was me, you, Wozniak, because Wozniak was part of our like little hip hop collective. We used to like, hey dude, used to mess with him, and I think it was you and Wozniak that got in an argument, and Darnell Ford was like. He was like, what did he say? He said something, man, but it was like his infinite wisdom. And he's like, what do all these things have in common in music and da-da-da? And we're like, what are you talking about? It's the vibration. It all has vibration. I don't know if you remember that speech he gave us, man. But
man, the guy gets so many speeches, I don't know, man. I don't remember. That sounds vaguely familiar. There's also a story with me and DB where we were having some words, man, and he was a first class and I was a third class, and his words were that was the way it was supposed to go, and I wasn't having it. And Tim, you remember Nordine, right?
Yeah, Nordine. Shout out to Nordine. Yeah, I'm actually gonna hang out with his uncle in Durango, Colorado this weekend. So
oh, nice. Tim just came on board at my company a while back, so he's a coworker of mine actually again after 15, 18 years later.
Wow.
But Tim was kind of old school, and he said, let's go up to Radar 4 and let's handle it. So he brought DB and me up to Radar 4, and Radar 4 had a cipher lock on it with only a handful of people had the code, right? So he throws us in Radar 4, and he's like, all right, work it out.
Oh, you serious? Like, you guys was about to go at us.
Yeah, but I think that he thought, like, that wouldn't happen, or that like
Yeah.
maybe that's not what he meant. But I took off my hat and I was like, "Let's go, bro." And me and DB met up in the middle of Radar 4, and we started wrestling around for a minute. And Tim finally pulled us apart, and he's like, "What are you doing, dude? You can't fight a first class petty officer." And I was like, "That's what you said, man. You said handle it." So,
Oh, that's funny, man.
me and DB are cool now, but yeah, man, that was a wild time. But yeah, so the band thing, we had that space in Radar 4 that was basically ours. It was an old 2M shop, and nobody used it anymore. DB was the 2M guy, and he had a shop down on like the main deck, and he liked being down there and playing his music and being social and stuff. So yeah, so nobody really messed with the other 2M stations. So I brought my bass on board. Wozniak had a guitar. This kid that was in the shop with me, ET3 Smith, James Smith, we called him Smitty.
Yeah, I remember Smitty. Yeah, he's from Texas as well. Yeah, I remember Smitty.
Yeah, he was a Texas dude. I recently just got into touch with him on Facebook again after, years and years. But he had there was that radar dome right outside of Radar 4, this big dome for the 35, which was like an air search radar that never worked. Even when he would spend days fixing it, like something that would break the next day, right? That guy, like, that's all he ever did was fix that damn thing.
Yeah.
But so he was the drummer, but we didn't have any drums on board. So we were like, man, that'd be cool if we could start a band. And it turns out I knew this girl from the SARDET, and she was like, hey, one of our Helo pilots is a drummer, and she brought an electronic drum set.
Wow.
And the SARDET doesn't have any room to store it. So she said that if you guys can store it in your space, that your guy can play it. And we were like, what? No way. We're going to get a band together. So we talked to this. I think she was like a lieutenant. She was a Helo pilot. She let us grab her stuff. She just wanted the code to the room so she could come up and practice, which she never did. She was flying missions all the time. Mm-hmm. So we had this little band going, man. And we wrote a bunch of originals. We had this guy that was, he worked with Wozniak that was the singer. I think his name was Brandon, but I can't remember his last name. And we wrote some originals. Me and Wozniak were into punk. So was he, and Smitty was kind of like into whatever. Like, he wasn't a big punk, but he was cool with punk. And he was also into like just straight up like rock. So we wrote a bunch of songs. We learned some covers. We covered Sublime. We covered some Green Day. And so the Steel Beach Picnic was coming up, and we're like, hey, man, let's play a show on the ship, right? Mm-hmm. And like that'd be cool. So we get it all dialed in with like MWR and stuff, and then like I think it was the night before or the day before, maybe like 2 days before, the MWR officer came calling, and he was like, hey, man, I got to hear you guys play, because like I don't know what you know what I mean? Like I can't approve this until I've heard you. And like our stuff was not super like everybody friendly, you know what I mean? Like it was punk, and some of the covers were like mellow, but like still not everybody's cup of tea, and maybe not like super politically correct or appropriate, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We had songs about like getting too drunk to, walk anymore. We had songs about like an ex. We play Sublime songs that talk about smoking weed and everything. So this guy wants to come hear us, and we're like, dude, what do? We can't play him any of our songs, you know what I mean? So we used to warm up and kind of like sound check our levels and stuff with this old like jam that we wrote that sounded super like 70s to us. Mm-hmm. It didn't have any words. It was probably like very loosely a cover of like any standard 70s song, you know what I mean? It was just kind of a jam that we would like warm up with. So when he came in, we just played that for like 5 minutes straight. We didn't say any words. We didn't do anything. He's like, oh, are you guys just instrumental? And we were like, yeah, mostly. Like, we just straight up lied to this dude. And he's like, oh, okay, cool, And so he's like, yeah, we're good. We'll see you at the picnic, and gave us the time and everything. We took a bed sheet and some spray paint, and we were calling ourselves the Pirates.
Yeah, I remember that.
But Wozniak had to spell it with a Y, right? It couldn't just be regular Pirates. It had Pirates.
Blueberry Park, yeah.
So we took this big bed sheet and we spray painted Pirates with a Y on it. We had like a stencil and like tried to make it look, somewhat legit. And we hung it from that Radar 4 area where where the dome is, and they built up the stage right behind it. And I think it was Danny. I think he was the one setting up like the sound and everything.
Oh, Danny Hayes?
Yeah, Danny Hayes.
Oh yeah,
I
that's
think
my
so.
boy right there. Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Wasn't he like, because he was doing
He's
he was
like
doing
PAO.
something like that, right?
Yeah, PAO. Yeah, he's a P. PAO. Yeah.
Yeah, so he like set up the sound for us, and we got up there and we just started playing our songs, and we led off with that instrumental jam that we had played for the for the MWR officer, you know, and some of the like older dudes were jamming and stuff like that, and they were like, all right, yeah, this is cool, and then Wozniak hit that distortion pedal, and we started playing some super fast like old punk, and yeah, it was cool, man. Like a lot of our friends thought it was fun, and you know, I think people were just excited that something different was happening. But
Yeah.
I think that MWR officer and some of the old timers were not stoked that there was like a 3-piece punk band up there singing about smoking dope and getting hammered and
They
whatever.
cheated. No, I was man. You brought up some good memories, and then I didn't I was actually in New York not too long ago. We did saw the 9/11 museum, and you don't realize that was damn near 18, 19 years ago, and it feels like to me yesterday. I mean, now that we talk about it,
It's wild, dude. I was in a parking lot a couple months ago, and I was on my bike, my motorcycle, and I was sitting there for a minute because I was waiting for a store to open up. It opened at like 10, and I was there at like 9:50 or something. So I was just hanging out, waiting for it to open, and this kid walks up to me, and he's like, I say kid because he, you know, to me, he looked like a kid.
yeah,
We started talking about bikes, and he saw some of my tattoos, and he's like, "Oh, were you in the Navy?" And I was like, "Yeah." And, you know, "Oh, when'd you go in?" I was like, 99 to 04. And he's like, "Oh man, you were in during September 11th." And I'm like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Yeah, I remember being in like first grade and watching that."
wow,
School. And he's like, "That's why I joined the Navy, but it's always weird to me to see guys that were like there during it." And I was like, "Bro, you're like a child, man."
like we're Vietnam vets, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it made me feel super old. Like he was super nice and respectful, and he was just like, you know, thanking me for my service, you know, which most people do when you tell them you're a vet.
Yeah.
Super, you know, he meant well, but it was funny because I was like, damn, I'm like the old vet now. I'm sitting out here on a Harley in a parking lot. I'm like,
because that was like, when you say it, man, like, because I know I was in like 97 till 2002. And yeah, well, I was in my early 20s, and like even now, you know, like I talked to my daughter's, she'll be 13 in 2 months, but it's just like, wow, you know, when we talk about that timepiece. But thank you for sharing your stories, and what are your closing thoughts? Like, what are your me personally, I didn't enjoy being on the ship. At the time I didn't, but then after a while, in retrospect, man, it was some of the best times I had, and like fellow shipmates like you, we haven't talked in years, but you know, we get together, it's like, you know, time never went by, and then during that time you really get to know people.
Yeah.
The best decision in my life, and then even that ship life, it's nothing can ever mimic or mirror that. And what are your thoughts about your military career and serving?
Well, I kind of agree with you, man, that it's the coolest and best thing I ever did for myself. But during the time, I didn't think so. You know what I mean? I was a kid, man. I didn't know better. I was always mad that they were telling me to cut my hair, and I was mad that they were telling me to put a belt on, you know, and all this stuff that is just part of military life of not being an individual. You know, I wanted to be different, and I wanted to be a smart ass. And, you know, now when I look back on it, it's some of the greatest times of my life. I made some of the best friends of my life.
Yeah.
Last year, the Bonhomme Richard had its 20th anniversary of its commissioning.
And I saw that online.
Yeah, Steve Joseph, who I became friends with kind of after I got out, just because he was friends with some of my friends. He was like, "Hey, I'm coming out for it. Can I crash at your place?" And I was like, "Yeah, for sure." And he said, "Well, hey, they want a +1, or they're giving us +1s. You want to come?" And I was like, "Yeah, man, I'm not a plank owner, but I'll go back." And I went, or I walked around that ship. There were like 70 of us, Mark.
Yeah.
All plank owners, and some of us that weren't plank owners but still lived in San Diego and just wanted to go. And we just walked around the ship, went to our old little spots on the boat, and like, dude, it came back. It was like I was there again, but like in a good way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's just wild, man. I still work for the Navy as a civilian now, and I bump into people from the ship. You know, like I said, Tim and I work in the same company now, and old Chief Skinner, maybe he made senior chief. I don't know if you remember Mike Skinner, but he was like an OS, I think. He was down there in the dark rooms with you. He works around there. Like, it's just always, Katie, she was gas then, she's Craig now, but
Yeah.
You know, she like got me my first job in the government, and
Oh, wow.
you know, those bonds go on forever, man. Like, you know, people always say that it's kind of like college, but I think it's like even better than college. You get all the same benefits of college, like that fraternity, you know, vibe afterwards, and the connections and all that. But you get to see the world, man, and you get to do some shit that like not a lot of kids want to do or get the opportunity to be a part of, you know?
Yeah, think about it. We were young and in charge of multi-million-dollar equipment, and then like the funny thing, like me, Severs, Bishop, like you said, I run into people. Hell, have some of the jobs I had was because of my connections, and I was able to help out some shipmates. I remember like we were out to sea.
I mean, look at you. You were like 20 years old landing helicopters.
Oh,
dude.
Yeah. In charge of
That's wild,
multi-million-dollar aircraft, right? Yeah. And I never really thought about it until I got into the FAA. I was like, whoa, this is it's real. But I remember crazy. We were like, you're out to sea, and you see these people all the time, so you get to know like very intimate things about their lives. Like one day it was me, Severs, and Bishop. Everybody in HDC, and like for 2 days, we're naming off 80 songs. You sit there like, but you're out to sea. That's all you know. And then like, I laugh because like you mentioned Wozniak, and like me and this little kid. Well, he's not a kid anymore. We hung out deep sometimes too, and it's just those bonds. You know, man. Like even now, like talking to you is like just bringing up memories that fond, great memories.
Well, I think it's crazy too, especially you talking about Wozniak, and like, you know, it's nothing like groundbreaking, but it's definitely something that I feel like other places growing up lack, right? Because you're a dude from Mississippi that is into hip hop, and Wozniak is like a young, skinny white kid from California who's into punk rock, right? And you guys used to mess around with music all the time, bonded over that. I remember you coming to me one time and like, I was messing around with the bass line, and you were kind of, you know, running some bars over it. But like, I think that's one of the coolest things about the Navy is you get a bunch of kids from all over different parts of the country. Some people different parts of the world, man.
Yeah.
And you have a common goal, and you go out and you hang out, and like it really changes your perspective on life. You know, especially like, you know, in the world we live in now, where everything's so crazy all the time, so divided a lot of times. Like,
I was thinking you hit the nail on the button, man. Because I tell people, like in the military, and they break you at that, and I think in boot camp, you're one color. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like you're talking about me, you, Wozniak. I remember Nordine was heavy in the drum and bass. Like, and we all like had that common bond. And you mentioned Danny, all of us.
And me and Tim are like, you know, full sleeved out, tattooed, but we're hanging out with like people that you wouldn't expect like a couple like big dudes with tattoos. Like people wouldn't think that you get along, but everybody does because, you know, A, you don't have a choice, but B, you have a common mission, man. Like everybody has a common goal, and you learn to like, you tune out that bullshit of like, hey, you're different from me. You came from a different place. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's one of the biggest things. And I talk about that with my brother a lot too. My brother was in the 80s, so it was a different time, but you know, he's like me. He's very talkative, and, you know, he thinks that he's, you know, good with people and conversations and stuff like that. And it's because he went in the Navy when he was like 17 years old, you know, and he got exposed to different cultures and different countries, you know, not just within the Navy, just where you go too. You know, I mean, we got to hang out with the people of Thailand, the people of Singapore. We got to hang out with a bunch of cool Australians when we went there, like the 3 different times we went there, you know. So I don't know, man. Like I said, like I look back on it super fondly. I don't have a regret in my mind about it, but I know when I was there, you know, as a 19, 20, 21-year-old kid, I was a little smart ass, and sometimes I wish I would have, you know, realized the gravity of the situation a little better. But hey, here we are, and everything's good, you know.
Yep. So, ET3 Holden, Matt Holden, man, thank you for coming on Sea Stories. Thank you for being my first guest.
Thanks for having me, man.
Not a problem, man. And thank you for the memorable stories of the Bonhomme Richard. I'm pretty sure once we share this, a lot of our shipmates are going to chime in.
Yeah, I hope they do, man. I hope they do.
Yeah. So, hey, I know you're out there in La Mesa, California. I miss it out in La Mesa. I'm out here in hot-ass Texas, but another time, another place. Wait, this is Mark and Matt, and we're signing off on the first episode of Sea Stories. Thanks for having me,
later, man.
You have a good one.
Hey, you too, Mark. Thanks, bro.